Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming out tonight. I'm very, very excited to be here and to have this conversation we're about to have. This is an exciting event for us. This is the celebration of a new book of edited essays, edited by Veronica Chambers, that has just come out on the life and the cultural impact of Beyoncé Knowles. So looking at it from broad perspectives, we're going to get to talk about a lot of that tonight. I want to let you know that following the event, there'll be a book signing. You can buy the book. You can get all of the, everybody to sign the book right after this. My name is John Bass. I'm the director of the Mike Curb Institute for Music here at Rhodes. This is an endowed program that gives students opportunities and experiences to dig into the Memphis music story in a variety of ways. We work together to give students real-world experiences that tie into their liberal arts education they get. So, they explore themselves through the liberal arts, and they work through the Curb Institute to get some experiences that shape their time here, and also hopefully give them opportunities going forward. This event is also sponsored by the Lynn and Henry Turley Memphis Center, directed by Dr. Charles Hughes. Very thankful for their support. This is a program that connects our academic program to the city of Memphis in very broad ways. It's also sponsored by the music department, and we appreciate their support. I always remember, I forget this. So, this is a beautiful hall. It's a converted church. So, if restrooms in here are you have to go out this way. They're not out there. So I always forget to make that announcement. So if you need to use the restrooms there, you can go down either hallway, and there's a hallway in the back. Tonight's event really is the culmination of a year of work and a year of partnership with Isabel González Whitaker. Isabel has been a part of Rhodes for this academic year as a Curb Visiting Scholar. She's the third Curb Visiting Scholar. The first was blues artist Bobby Rush. The second was author Preston Lauterbach, and Isabel's been working with us throughout the year, working intentionally with students, helping them manage their programs, helping to get sort of an outside perspective. So, and again, a real-world perspective on the things that they're doing, the things that they're developing, the things that they're creating. She also took 8 Curb Fellows and me on a trip to New York over spring break, and it was this whirlwind tour, meeting people, having fascinating conversations, exploring Memphis. Exploring music and culture, and especially how it relates back to, how it relates in New York and how it relates back to the city of Memphis. The conversations we had there and the conversations we've continued to have with the students are remarkable, and I think that's going to be something really transformational for our program. It's just been a wonderful year. Isabel will introduce the panelists in a second, but I just want to say that this is a remarkable group of people we have here, and Isabel is to thank for this. Some of the top writers, journalists, activists, and emerging artists, and people thinking about music and branding and what the whole experience is like. So I can't wait to hear what happens on stage. But just a word about Isabel, she was the deputy editor at Billboard magazine, the features editor at In Style for many years in New York. She's a journalist. Her stories have explored the connections between popular culture and current events, especially these things that you see on the news, how they intersect with music, how music can be a changing force. She was instrumental in Billboard taking many stands against things like gun violence, foregrounding these conversations within music and within culture. Very, very important work. She was also a presidential leadership scholar, where she worked to create a park in her hometown of Atlanta. This was the first park named in Georgia, named for a Latinx person, and this was her mother. So this was remarkable. She now works for Alsac and St. Jude, and is helping them do the amazing work that they do there. So thank you again for coming. I know you're in for a treat tonight. Thank you for everything this year, Isabel. It's been a real treat, and thank you all for joining us. And I will, with that, I'll let you introduce everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been transformative for me to be here and to move from New York and to be greeted in Memphis so warmly by the community and also by this university, and President Marjorie Hass and Dr. Bass has been really, this city is really special. And for those of you who are from here, live here, intend to stay here, I think that the energy here, and I hope that Veronica and Carmen, you've seen a little bit of that today. It's on the precipice of something really monumental with this foundational ethos around social justice and certainly music. So without further ado, let me tell you a little bit about our esteemed panelists. We wouldn't be here without Veronica Chambers, sitting here to my right. She's a journalist and editor who leads the archival storytelling team at the New York Times. She is the editor of a new anthology, and that would be this one, Queen Bey, Celebration of Power and Creativity of Beyoncé Knowles Carter. Her other books include New York Times bestsellers, Mama's Girl, and she co-wrote Yes Chef with Marcus Samuelsson and 32 Yolks with Eric Ripert. And not in this bio is also the work that she did with Robin Roberts and Michael Strahan on their memoirs. She was born in Panama. She's Afro-Latina, raised in Brooklyn, and she speaks and reads and writes fluently in Spanish. It's an honor to have you here. Can I just ask you, as I introduce each of you, favorite Beyonce song?
Right now, it's Mi Gente.
Same. Okay, great. Talibah Safiya, am I saying that right? Okay, great. Is an independent soul artist and jewelry designer from Memphis who I met, no joke, like 3 weeks after I moved here and felt an incredible spiritual kinship with her immediately, only to find out that she's a tremendous musician as well. Her jewelry line, Pretty Bull, was recently released a spring collection called Every Woman. Her music spreads messages of self-acceptance, exploration, and celebration. 2018 was full of exciting performance, from her mansion concert tour to festivals like Americana and Mempho. Talibah is awesome, and she's currently working on her debut album, where she will explore the trials and triumphs in exploring self and romantic love. This summer, she's headlining Deep Water Sound, a touring experience taking soulful Memphis music to 10 cities nationwide. Thank you for being here. Favorite Beyonce song?
I want to say Superpower to seem like intelligent, but then also Blow because it's my favorite. So.
There you go. Okay, Carmen Perez is a modern-day activist. She has dedicated 20 years to advocating for many of today's most important civil rights issues, including mass incarceration, gender equity, violence prevention, racial healing, and community policing. As the executive director of the Gathering for Justice, which is a nonprofit, for those of you who don't know, I love this, founded by legendary artist and activist Harry Belafonte, for whom she is a protege, truly. Carmen has crossed the globe promoting peace through civil and human rights, building alternatives to incarceration and violence, and providing commentary and guidance for state and federal policy creation. And this is why we're also very glad to have you here in Memphis, because so much of these issues are touching lives here daily. Carmen has spent time in jails and prisons nationally, as well as in El Salvador and in Venezuela. She's also the co-founder of Justice League New York and Justice League California, two state-based task forces for advancing juvenile and criminal justice reform agenda. She has organized numerous national convenings, including Growing Up Lockdown conferences on juvenile justice, and led the March to Justice, a 250-mile march through 5 states from New York City to Washington, D.C., which drew congressional attention to key legislative reforms to confront the national crisis in police violence. Do you sleep? And she has that beautiful baby who's cheering us on.
The answer is no.
Now especially you don't, not with cute Justice. A respected expert in the field of juvenile and criminal justice system accountability, Carmen was invited to testify before the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing, was featured speaker and co-convener of the 20th anniversary of the Million Man March, Justice Rouse, and has been featured in numerous media and TV outlets, which is how I met her. Carmen's work in her role as the national co-chair of the Women's March on Washington helped draw over 5 million people across the globe who marched, many of them for the very first time, in resistance of hatred and bigotry, affirming women of all identities' rights as human beings. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Favorite Beyonce song?
So I I have to say in the different parts of my life, one is Flawless. I woke up like this, as well as Runs the World and Formation.
There you go.
So-
Well, I know in your essay you talk about, I think it was either Formation or Who Runs the World was the soundtrack to the planning of the Women's March.
Yeah, it was, and it was also Love on Top.
Love on Top.
Yeah, we
That's right.
played that
One of my
over and
favorites.
over and over and over.
Very. James Duke, thank you for being the male representative on this panel. AKA I Make Mad Beats, is an artist, producer, engineer, and founder of Unapologetic, a creative company. His professional career started at Quad Studios in Manhattan, which is a really big deal for those of you who may not know, working with music industry stars Ludacris, Solange, Busta Rhymes, and eventually placing music with TV shows, commercials, and movies. After moving back to Memphis, thank you for moving back, James created Unapologetic, a company built on the idea of building boldly and unapologetically yourself in ways that inspire others to do the same. The organization includes a record label, video production company, event coordination, and a clothing line, and I can affirm that it's awesome because I bought one of the cardigans. Unapologetic has provided music for national TV commercials, sitcoms, and other artists and organizations across the world, and in 2017, James designed and launched the Unapologetic World app, a hub for those interested in a deeper look into your music and visual endeavors. And he just did a TED Talk here in Memphis that was very powerful called Someone's Waiting on You to Be You, which could be a Beyonce song.
Hey, I'm down with that.
Tell us what your favorite is.
So that was it was hard to answer that. I think it depends on what part of my life, right? So me being a really big hip hop head, Crazy in Love was big for me. But I think further in my adulthood, the song that she did, Heartbeat, which was about her miscarriage, that meant a lot to me. So
It's beautiful. I'll just say for the record, mi gente, I'm feeling it right now. It's not my all-time favorite, but my essay for your book was all about her Latinx identity, so I listened to it a lot. But let's talk a little bit, Veronica, about the inspiration for this book and how it came to be.
Sure. So before this book, I had done a collection of essays about Michelle Obama, and it had done really well. And my editor said, "Okay, who could we possibly write about next?" And I was like, "After Michelle Obama?" And we literally would talk about it, and I just thought, "There's nothing. There's no one." And then one day she came in and she said, "Beyonce." And I thought, so interesting, so different. The Michelle Obama book was so much about stepping into a political identity, about marriage through a different lens, about motherhood through a different lens. And what was really exciting for me was that I wasn't a super fan to the point where I couldn't even think straight. Like, I was actually super intellectually interested in all the levels of her career. And when you really looked at it, it was almost like looking at a fine artist and saying, oh, when you say Picasso had this period and this period, there's definitely, like, Beyonce's had so many periods and layers of work, and she's still going. And so it was exciting to be able to think, okay, I can get 21 authors to talk and think about these ideas.
It was a fun process.
Yes. And Isabel worked with us as our editorial coordinator, director, just helped us pull
Well,
the book together.
thank you. It was an honor to work on it. So you talk in your chapter about her playing by her own rules, which I think is a really important optic in this day and age. Can you talk about the moment that you saw that she, what you called, invented the power of her freedom, and why is that important?
Yeah, so in the essay I referenced a June Jordan quote where she said Black women have always had to invent the kind of power that their freedom requires. And I think that for me, the moment when Beyonce stepped off of the stage for 9 months and traveled and didn't worry about being on top all the time was very powerful because, to quote her, one of her DJ Khaled lyrics, came, effed up the game, went away, effed it up again. Like, it takes a lot of confidence to say, I'm going to step away and I'm not going to worry about how you're going to think about me when I come back. And I thought that was tremendously powerful. I think power, I'm interested in what Lady Justice says about this because I think to me, power and freedom, the more that I go on tour and talk about this book, power and freedom are so central to her story.
Well, Carmen, talk a little bit about her relationship with power and what she does with her power on behalf of community.
So for me, when I think about Beyonce, and I particularly think about what she did at the Super Bowl and what she also did at Coachella, right? Really employing...
Baychella.
Yeah. I think for me was like the time in which she really unleashed her power in a very visible stage, a stage that obviously families tune in every Sunday and Monday and even Wednesdays, or depending on what day Thanksgiving is, right? And so for me to receive that in the screen and now have a different conversation amongst my own family, who probably isn't as woke as, you know, people try to make their families seem when they are woke themselves, but that changed the conversation for many folks. And it also brought this visibility of, I would say, racism and bigotry to a very visible stage as well, in the sense of how many people had pushback as it pertained to that performance. But the display, the Black Power fist, also the way in which she kind of used sexiness, right? I think there was some debate around her over-sexualizing the movement, but I think it was brilliant in the sense of creating entry points for people who are not attracted to the movement work.
Right. Yeah, and in your essay, you talk a lot about that, and I thought it was almost a radical realization for me that there was a question that, why didn't she show up at the march, right? Or, she has, I think, she finds her own avenues for protest, and she finds her own avenues to make statements. And to do it, like you said, at the Super Bowl, brought it into people's living rooms in a way that they were forced to confront, a history, a conversation that these people wouldn't have normally necessarily engaged in. Can you talk a little bit, James, about the power of music to do that and the power of performance to do that?
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, Super Bowl, Baychella, I think watching her and her husband take similar leaps in that direction, recently. Music is interesting because when you make music, people listen, and it's interesting because music is art, and art is created to be vulnerable, right? It's created to be something that pushes down walls and is limitless, right? Art is meant to make people uncomfortable, make people think, right? But with the commercialization of music, a lot of people just get caught up in this idea that, music, which is art, is just to simply make you dance or to help you have a good time. And yes, it is for those things, but it's for much more than that as well, right? We can go back to Strange Fruit. We can go back to Nina Simone. There are many examples of music, pushing boundaries. And in those moments, right, where you have these artists that have at least temporarily transcended whatever they look like, and then all of a sudden they come back around and remind you what they look like and the things that come with what they look like. Those are some of the most interesting intersections of life possible, because then you see a whole bunch of people on Instagram mad, like, wait a minute, you're saying you're black? Look, man, why are you doing this? And it's just like, right. Music is interesting in that way, that it can seep into your mind and take up space and then explode with a reality that makes you have to think about yourself.
Thank you. Talibah, I want you to talk as the sole female singer, songwriter on stage. What did Beyonce mean to you growing up, and in terms of cultivating your own artistry?
Well, I've been listening to Beyonce since the beginning. My first CD ever was Destiny's Child, Writings on the Wall. My parents who are here can attest to how much I played that back to back to back. Thank you, guys. So for me, initially, it was just incredible to see a black woman be so confident in standing in front and saying, making it clear that she wanted to be on top. I think a lot of times we'll tiptoe and speak around the desire to be number one, and she was very direct with, like, it's clear that she's trying to be the best. And I think that that's extremely powerful, and she was playful with it at a younger age. Then so it was kind of like maybe an ellipses at saying, I want to be the best, and then it became a period, and then it became like an exclamation mark, like, I'm not here to play with y'all. And so watching that transition from younger to becoming a woman and to stepping out as her own manager and the person to make the rules for her career, and even witnessing her going from her music being centrally talking about men and seemingly the focus being on beauty and dancing, and it was pretty surface. Watching it get deeper, I think, was really powerful for everyone, because she transcends with the times and gives people what they're able to swallow when they're ready, you know. So, because if she was talking about things like she does in Flawless or Bow Down or Formation, when she first came out, I don't think people would have been able to hear it as clearly. So it's like she's listening to what people need. So for me, just watching her different transitions lets me know that there's no one way to be as an artist, and you don't have to commit to who you were being who you are or who you will be. I don't think very many artists have made as many transitions as she has, so it's kind of like this permission to say it's okay to grow, it's okay to shift, it's okay to use your platform in a different way as it becomes bigger. So just, she's given permission for me.
What about when, and some of the essays in the book talk about this too, when, and I hardly call it stumble, but I think one of the essays talks about, I think it was Lena Waithe talked about how she showed that it's okay to stumble, and that sort of vulnerability around stumbling, which I think almost it sort of echoes some of your sentiment in your TED Talk about being unapologetically yourself. Can each of you talk about why, or I'll start with you, Veronica, why is it important to see her as a whole being and not just an artist?
I think that one of the things, Fatima Robinson, who's a choreographer who works with Kendrick Lamar and Pharrell and has worked with Beyonce, wrote one of the essays in the book. And it was really interesting to hear Fatima talk about it from a dance perspective, because she was saying that one of the reasons why we kind of are attracted to Beyonce on the level that we do is that she's actually showing us that growth, that when an artist is so fully in the space of, I've learned something, I've been somewhere different, and I'm going to tell you that it becomes more than a commercial thing they're selling you. Hey, a new album. It becomes closer to a phenomenon. And, you know, it's funny when you think back, like, to go all the way back to something like Janet Jackson, like Rhythm Nation was Janet Jackson's exploration of, I'm dealing with race, I'm dealing with this, I'm dealing with that. And it became a phenomenon. You know, like, I think that there's a really powerful place that an artist can get to. I mean, I think it's why Kendrick, in the moment that he exploded, there was so much vulnerability, questioning, but also like just layers of growth within himself. This is what I'm struggling with. This is what I've just beat. This is what I'm dealing with now. And I think that when that is laid bare in a really masterful way, it's really hard to resist. I think that it's part of what we see, especially in the surprise albums. You know, you don't feel like this is something from the old days when the record company said, and you'll have this cover, and these will be the tracks, and this will be the single. I mean, there's such huge, like, display of artistry and craft that feels very personal.
Yeah. Thank you. I would love to, because we have Carmen, you hear and you talk so much about the importance of knowing your history. Can you talk a little bit about, because I think some of the themes that Veronica's touching on now also are reflected in the work that Harry Belafonte did, right? And the stances that he took were vulnerable, risky stances at a time when he was also trying to sell records. what did you learn? What have you learned from being in his such close proximity to him around his strategic approach to music and activism?
So I think when, you sit in a room with Mr. Belafonte, he demands this presence. He is one of the most, I would say, intelligent people that I've ever met, because he is connected to what is happening on the now and has dedicated all his life to advancing the liberation of Black people and brown people as well. And Mr. Belafonte is now 91. So just imagine all the different contributions he made, not only to the civil rights movement, but also USA for Africa, violence prevention, going to different countries, looking at different prisons. But what I find is that Mr. Belafonte will say for himself is that he was an activist before he was an artist. He was impacted by many issues like poverty and violence. And so for him, he was activated at a very young age while he was roaming the streets of Harlem and impacted and witnessing the injustices on the streets, and also witnessing and experiencing them in his own home. But what I find to be sorry, I get distracted sometimes when my baby is like, hey,
talking to
you. It's kind of like, okay, how do we navigate this world and balance it? But what I find to be very encouraging is that Beyonce and Jay are doing the same thing, right? And it wasn't as visible. I think for Mr. Belafonte is that he was taking a risk, but he believed in the people who were on the front lines, to the point that he was using his platform as an artist to singly, fully fund the civil rights movement and to create access to people like Dr. King to meet with the individuals who were running this country, like John F. Kennedy, the president. There were moments in which many people would call on Mr. Belafonte to have meetings with him, and he would say, well, actually, I need you to meet with Dr. King or the members of SNCC. And so he used his platform to leverage the power and giving folks that were on the front lines access, which is something that I think, while you were talking, reminded me of what Beyonce is doing. I think the reason why we're so attracted to her is because we feel that she's accessible, right? And we also know that Beyonce is somebody that I think is intentional about being somebody who is not only accessible, but she also kind of navigates this world that allows you to feel that people like ourselves are not monolithic. So seeing her various forms of, I would say, evolving into who she is now allows me to be like, yo, I could be like her, right? Or I feel her, or I've been through that, right? Through her music, it's relatable, it's tangible, so you don't feel as though that there's like this wall that's in between you and her. And I think that's what Mr. Belafonte tried being, is he tried being the person that was accessible and trying to leverage, but he got blacklisted, right? He was blacklisted for many years, where he wasn't able to, he was the headliner for different, I would say, institutions, but he wasn't allowed to stay in the same hotels that his musicians got to stay in. But it was because of his commitment to making sure that those that were on the front lines were constantly being elevated.
I mean, and I think that brings up a greater question. Can Beyonce do what she does because she has defined her own sense of power? Or are emerging artists such as yourselves allowed to have platforms? What do you think? Go ahead, James.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that we're allowed to have platforms. I think Memphis is kind of an anomaly in this sense, right? Where, this is almost 70% Black city with this level of visibility internationally, right? So, whether you're in LA, we literally just got back from LA days ago, constantly running into people from Memphis or people who admired Memphis. I walked into a guy's office, and more than half the pictures on the wall were Memphis artists. And so Memphis is internationally visible, internationally celebrated, and extremely Black, And so what that means for an artist here versus, somewhere where this is not the circumstances, is that I can comfortably be more black, right? I think a lot of the crossroads that black artists or black people, period, if you're ambitious, right? A lot of our space when we have ambition is, excuse me, is figuring out when to speak out about being black and then when to strategically word it a different way or, find a way to get in and, make sure you don't make them uncomfortable because then they might not give you the resources that you need and all of that. You know what I'm saying? And yes, we definitely have to deal with that here to some extent. But it's a little bit different when you're way more likely to see someone who looks like you and is from a similar culture to you when you walk down the street, right? In fact, that was one of the big advantages of growing up in Orange Mound, where it's a historically black community. Being at home with your black identity was just built into being in that or from that community.
What do you think, Talibah?
I think that the people who have come before give us permission to have platforms, and at this point, I think people really want people to have platforms, so you'll get lifted higher if you really stand for something, and I think that's because of artists like Mr. Belafonte and Beyonce. There's a point where superficiality isn't enough, or just a beautiful voice or a beautiful face isn't enough. And we're at really crucial times where people want to know that somebody is listening to them, somebody can feel their energy, that they need something more, and that they need people to speak for them if they can't do it for themselves. So I think it's not even just a question of can you have a platform. It's kind of like, at this point, is it a necessity to have a platform? It's required nearly to be celebrated, especially in the black community, because at this point, when Mr. Belafonte was doing his work, they were asking for permission to be political things. And now we're at a point where we're able to actually celebrate black culture, which is something that everybody wants a piece of, right? So Beyonce is doing something that makes people excited about black culture. So what she's doing doesn't even sound political. It just sounds like blackness being put on the song, and the fact that it's become political can tell you why black people have to be so political, because in order to even talk about our culture, it's all of a sudden like a political statement. But it's like, just because you're addressing the fact that the police harass black people, or you talk about having nappy hair, or being with a black man, or celebrating the black family, like, why is that even political? That's why it's necessary for us to have a platform, because that shouldn't even be such a political statement. It should just be normal. Like, there are black families. I grew up with a black mother and a black father with braids and beads in my hair, and it was normal for me, and my neighborhood was black, and that was normal, and I was never a minority anywhere I was. It took white teachers to tell me that I was a minority. I didn't even know, so, I mean, the platforms, we have to have them. It's not a question. It's like, nobody wants to hear you just talking about how cute you are anymore. Like, we're over that. Like, we're talking about emotions, we're talking about feelings, we're talking about politics, we're talking about black bodies, we're talking about permission.
Is that part of the reason why both of you came back to Memphis? I mean, Memphis to me is such a heartbeat of the country in terms of every social justice issue that's happening in the United States. And I often also say that I've lived in cities where they commoditize art and culture really well, but culture is made here in Memphis. What has it been like for the two of you to go out into the world as representatives of Memphis? How does it inform your work? And, in a larger sort of sense, too, like we talk a lot of who Beyonce is, and in the essay I wrote, is her southernness. Can you guys talk about that briefly? And I am going to open it up to questions very shortly, but I had to ask that question.
So just full disclosure, because I don't ever want to make sure everybody understands. When I moved back here, when I left here, I was running and screaming away from here. I don't want to give this false narrative that I just extremely loved Memphis my whole life. No, I did not. I graduated from White Station High School, and 7 days later, I was gone. I ended up in New York to pursue my career in music. When I did come back here, I noticed something happening here. I noticed, to make a long story short, I saw something bending in a direction, and I had to make sure it broke in that direction, right? And I found that my experiences could help me be a part of the solution, right? I had spent enough time in New York, learned a lot of things, and I saw metaphorical potholes here. Also, not so metaphorical potholes, here, and that I could help fill. But yes, a big part of staying here, right, was this idea that, again, I'm from Orange Mound. Rest in peace, Phil Trineri, who I had a really good conversation with about a month before he passed, where he let me know that Orange Mound is the neighborhood with the highest level of civic pride and civic engagement in the city of Memphis, right? So we have our own parades, we do all kind of stuff in Orange Mound. It's one thing to come from poverty and then you go out into the world, you make it, and you're a successful entrepreneur, and you celebrate. It's another thing to come from poverty, go out in the world, you make it, you come back, and then you realize, wow, me getting out of here was a real anomaly. This was, there are a lot of people who had similar circumstances who are stuck in those circumstances, right? And like I said in my TED Talk, I am historically, and some people in the audience can attest to this, socially awkward, quiet, and shy. But you would never know it now. Why? Because I have transformed into something, because I am a messenger. I have to speak for people and a constituency because things have to change. And so sometimes that takes, like you said, this is no longer optional, right? The platform is, do I want to be a musician or those days are gone, right? I make mad beats. I do so much other things now because things mean a lot more than just making beats now,
Do you want to add anything to that, Talibah?
Yes. Well, first, I wanted to tell you, I thought it was incredible that he started at Quad, because that was the first place I went to when I moved to New York City.
Oh,
that was the very first place that
Which
I
studio?
recorded a song. I don't know.
Okay.
We were on 48th and 9th.
Okay, yeah.
I thought that was pretty cool that we're both from Memphis and ended up at the same studio. That's incredible. But as far as being from Memphis, I ran screaming as well. I was like, get me the hell out of here. But I came back whimpering, and I needed a hug. And this city, it makes me feel loved like no other place I've lived in. I haven't lived that many places, but there's something about Memphis, and it's loyal. So any narrative that we become a part of, might be loyal to it, right? So if we're a part of the musical narrative, we're loyal, and we want to make sure we're a part of that. If we're a part of the civil rights narrative, we're committed to it. If we're a part of the gangster, thug, Memphis city narrative, we're committed to all of these, right? And I think that a city with that type of commitment to itself needs people that are committed to the city and its narrative to help choose which one is going to shine the brightest, right? So living in New York, it was incredible. I learned a lot. I'm so glad that I lived there. But coming back home and seeing how much what I'm capable of could shift a space. In New York, what I was doing wasn't loud. It was a lot of people around that constantly reminded me of how powerful my city was. When I would tell people I was from Memphis, they would say, damn, they would be so impressed that with me being from Memphis and expect me to have all this soul. Thank goodness I actually do, because I would have been a grave disappointment. But for people to tell me how incredible my city was to them, it kind of let me step back and think about it. It's like, okay, I was running from this place and I was looking at it through one set of eyes, but people who haven't even touched the soil are able to celebrate it. Why am I not able to celebrate it? And just watching my family grow, wanting to be close to that and touch that, and seeing the community here and knowing how many small circumstances changed my life as a child. I could meet an artist that moved to New York and did a play there, or I could see a woman who came and was dressed a certain way, and I thought she was beautiful, and I'm like, oh, she's from Memphis, or you do this? It's like, I want to be that for young ladies to do better than I did. It's like every generation we want them to do better, so coming back home is like, oh, so all of this soul, the diaspora that is so heavily influential in this city is a part of me, and it's inescapable no matter where I am. So I would rather give back here than to, I think a lot of us when we leave, we kind of disappear, and we don't want to even be considered, like we don't want to come back. It feels like a failure to come back to a lot of people. But for me, it was a decision and a necessity to come back and contribute to this city that's given me everything. So,
Awesome. I'd love to open it up to questions. Does anybody have any questions? Because if not, I can happily ask many questions. Do you have one?
one thing is simply logistics. The time she came out, we were kids and impressionable. But then another thing is the adaptability, what we talked about. She shifted with the times, so she stayed with us. As we were kids, she was giving us what we needed then. And then as we get older, the conversation has stayed relevant. And that's just simply because she's an artist that pays attention. There's a lot of artists that came out at the same time that she did that either stopped paying attention to themselves as they related to the world, or the world as it related to them. But she's paid attention. I think there's very few artists that have remained a part of the conversation as we've grown to stay with us. I think she and maybe Erykah Badu, Jay, have kept along with us since they first came out in, I think, 97. So
I'm not a millennial, but I think Veronica, you know, one of the things in the book, and I'd love for you to talk about this, is how she so successfully appeals to millennials. Like, she's able to tap into almost the essence of every single different community. And, you know, like Kid Fury's essay about, you know, J-setting, for example, and bringing things. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I think that I'm also not a millennial. But but one of the things that's striking to me, and it makes me think of Carmen's work with Gathering for Justice, is that we constantly see that as certain institutions fall, new opportunities arise. And I think that when you think about the music business in the 2000s, the record labels were in a panic. You know, they weren't going to sell CDs. They weren't ready for streaming. All these different things happened. And I think one of the most amazing things is that combined with the kind of like very careful plotting of her career, at the minute that those old institutions were falling, because I think the current Beyonce wouldn't have been possible under the old paradigm of the industry. The industry wanted to control their artists. They thought they knew how to pick songs. They thought they knew who the best songwriters were. They wanted to make everything. And I think as those institutions weakened and new platforms and streaming became possible, it took away a layer between an artist like Beyonce and their audience. And she was one of the first and really adept at speaking directly to her audience. And so I think if you think about the platforms of streaming, of Instagram, what she's done visually, like we have a whole essay in the book about her social media and how she uses it to communicate ideas and information. I mean, she's really using the platforms that this generation is digital to, but it's also a great moment of creative freedom for any artist to be able to use these platforms.
Can I also make an addition? So this is something I wanted to say earlier. Having worked with some PR firms that are also PR firms for some of these artists, I also recognize that a lot of artists are muted. They are muted by individuals like what you were saying, who are saying this is who you need, this is who your audience needs to be, this is who you need to speak to. And I know that because while I was working, or I was organizing the Women's March, they were also trying to mute us women of color. And it just, you know, when we think about the boldness that Beyonce has, it's because she also has financial independence, right? And that is a huge contributor for her to be able to say and do the things that she needs to do in order to radicalize and to also mirror her communities that she's speaking to. But oftentimes, a lot of artists don't have the financial independence to then have the type of influence that Beyonce and Jay have.
I agree. Any other questions? Or you want to say something? Go for it.
I think there are two components to that, right? So I think like something that people always ask, you know, what genre of music does Unapologetic focus on? And I always say our genre of music is sincerity and vulnerability, right? I think this generation appreciates that, unlike any other, right? And so speaking on what Veronica mentioned about using the platforms, the current platforms, she's using these current platforms to expose that sincerity, that vulnerability, right? In a way that connects with young people. Kanye West did the same thing, right? And so I think it is that shameless, unapologetic sincerity and vulnerability that allows her to connect with that generation, I believe.
Hey, Veronica, what did you learn about yourself through this process of reading all these essays, and what did you learn about her?
Oh, that's a good question. I think that I learned about her is more interesting. I'd more like to talk about her than I like to talk about me. But I guess the thing that I'll sort of connect back to, especially because we're at a college and I know a lot of people in the audience are at early points in their career. When I first started out in journalism, I was working at the New York Times magazine, and my boss, I was 22 years old, I was the youngest editor they'd ever hired, and my boss said to me, I was also the first black woman they'd ever hired, and my boss said to me, the way you're going to be successful at the New York Times is learn how to think like a white man. And I started trying to plan my quit from there. I was just like, when can I quit? How am I going to quit? Where am I going to go? How am I going to get some money? Because I just thought something bad is going to happen to me if I try to stay here and do that. I think that it's funny, we were doing a radio show yesterday, and everyone kept talking about how she was blackity black black. And I thought, you know, the fact that I think the thing that I've learned most from her is how important it is to bring your whole self into the room, and that sense of being able to bring both the high-minded, sort of artistic level of black artists like Glenn Ligon and Lorna Simpson, and, you know, like we were talking about high and low culture. Black culture is high and low culture. Black culture is fine art, it's literature, it's Toni Morrison, it's all of that, and it's also, you know, trap and popular music and everything else. And I think that the way that the span of her influences, she doesn't have to go away from blackness to learn and to elevate. And I think that that's something that previous generations were taught, that integration was an elevation. And I think that she has really turned that upside on its head. And I think that that's a really subtle message that her fans get. I think that's why people love sharing her music with their children. And I think it's one of the reasons why I'm glad that my daughter's getting to grow up in a world of Beyonce. Because my daughter doesn't have this feeling of when people say, oh, the whole thing about a minority culture, she's like, my culture is every culture. My culture is everything you want and then some. And I think she gets that from artists like this who feel so rich and layered and complex.
It's great. Well, I think we're right about out of time. Does anybody have any more questions? Do you have any questions? Thank you so much, panelists. This was amazing.
Thank you.
An honor to be on stage with you all.